If you have experience, a country who invaded your country and then limited your movements, and then we lost most of our best people. It was really hard. That's why I say it's good that we move on, but it doesn't mean that we cannot talk about that.
You can take an action to speak up or to share your ideas or to fight the stereotype. Small progress is still a progress. It will make a better to our country or our community. Just trust in yourself and be yourself.
Welcome to the Stories for Action podcast, where we aim to elevate stories and spark connections to benefit the health of people and place. I'm your host, Laura Tomov. This past June, I was fortunate to travel to Southeast Asia, to the country of Timor-Leste, for a professional exchange fellowship program that's organized by the Mansfield Center at the University of Montana and the U.S. State Department. The Mansfield Center works to foster globally minded leaders and encourage democracy and bridge divides through the sharing of perspectives. This specific fellowship program is called YSEALI, Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. Salvador de Jesus is a young filmmaker from the country of Timor-Leste who was a participating fellow in the YSEALI program. In 2020, he traveled from his home in Timor-Leste to the U.S., with time spent in both Montana and Washington, D.C., learning, sharing, and experiencing elements of culture and diplomacy. As the exchange part of the fellowship, Salvador was then able to host someone from the U.S. who could work with him in his professional field in his country. I'm grateful that I was able to be that fellow filmmaker, to travel to Timor-Leste and work with Sal to host workshops about film and the power of elevating story for young people in that country. In this episode, I want to share about this time, my perspectives during this trip, perspectives that were shared with me from Timorese people, and what I learned from this mere glimpse into a place. Glimpses of cultural revival and cultural evolution, human-environment relationships, the sharing of stories of resistance to oppression, and their fights for freedom. Absorbing the contagious excitement of a younger generation, and learning through observation and interaction. I do want to note that the perspectives in this episode are purely my own or those who are being interviewed, and do not necessarily represent those of the Mansfield Center or the U.S. Department of State. Timor-Leste was formerly known as East Timor, and I admit, before this trip, I didn't know much about the country. The extent of my work travels to Asia had included Japan, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and India, which geographically and culturally are as distant to Timor-Leste as Canada is to Brazil. As soon as I found out I would be traveling to Timor-Leste for this program, I admitted my knowledge gap and dug deep into research. Library books, YouTube videos, podcasts, anything that shared about the history, the culture, the environment of Timor-Leste. This country immediately intrigued me, so the research became a welcome rabbit hole. And of course, anything that I share in this podcast is just scratching the surface, and of course from my perspective. So I encourage you to go on and continue seeking out stories from and about Timor-Leste. First, a little context on the country. In far Southeast Asia, in the Timor Sea, is an island about the size of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. The western portion of the island, West Timor, is currently part of Indonesia, and the eastern portion is the sovereign nation of Timor-Leste, formerly known as East Timor. Timor-Leste is geographically much closer to northwestern Australia than it is to mainland Asia, sitting only about 400 miles from Darwin, Australia. Timor-Leste reclaimed its independence 22 years ago, after roughly 400 years of Portuguese colonization, followed by 25 years of Indonesian occupation. So it's a relatively young democracy. Today, the country works to uplift its identity as a sovereign nation, to reconnect to traditions, and build up its economies, which up until now have been largely dependent on offshore natural gas and oil development, some of which is tapping out. There's a great deal of agriculture here, though much of it is sustenance farming for local residents to consume, but coffee is a prominent agricultural export. The country's population is about 1.3 million people, with about 20% of the population living in the capital city of Dili. There are a couple of other smaller cities with small townships and rural villages throughout. Over 40% of the population live below the national poverty line. Hundreds of native languages have been spoken on these lands for thousands of years, though for the last few hundred years the prominent language was Portuguese, due to it being a colony of Portugal. Everyone here still speaks Portuguese, it seems, but today the native language of Tetun has earned the title of the nation's primary spoken language. The island is within the Coral Triangle, which is a region of ocean that's boasted as being the most biologically complex marine ecosystem on the planet, due to being home to 76% of the world's shallow water reef-building corals and 37% of the world's reef fish species. For myself, as a scuba diver and marine science nerd, this region has always intrigued me. As a sovereign nation for the first time in 400 years, the government and the people of Timor-Leste are working to build up independent economies, now focusing on tourism, agriculture, and energy. As this process of development is taking place, Salvador and other filmmakers in Timor-Leste hope that the film industry can be one of the economic drivers here. Currently, only a few people work in film production, and if they do, it's on a small scale or as a side hustle to another income. Sal says that many folks don't even know that film production is an option for a career path. Sal's objectives for my visit included sharing with locals about potential career paths in film and how a film industry can be a notable economic driver. He also wanted me to share how storytelling can be a tool for advocacy and empowerment, and to provide entry-level technical training in camera, audio, and lighting for young people, either to spark a professional path in media or to share tools for advocacy groups to make their own outreach videos. Our workshop team included Sal, myself, and Ratna Gusmeo, a gentle and astute woman with a strong theater background, who became our amazing producer. Over the course of 2 weeks, the three of us worked together to host 14 workshops for over 400 Timorese people, largely folks in the 15 to 25-year-old age range. We presented in universities, high schools, and learning centers, with a combination of presentation, discussion, and hands-on instruction with cameras. In the workshops, we discussed how with today's access to endless channels of public communication, and as the narratives of Timor-Leste are shared with the world, how important it is to have those stories be told by Timorese people. There are smartphones available in Timor-Leste direct from China, starting at about $40, and with social media being seemingly free to access, it's something that the majority of folks here have access to, regardless of their income bracket. In the workshops, we discussed this powerful storytelling tool that most people had right there in their pockets. The fortune of living in a time where getting your story out there firsthand had become so universally accessible, but also the impact of living in a time where we absorb narratives and ideas in a quick scroll motion, making us more prone to just look at a headline or a quick takeaway without taking the time to see the complexity in the subject or to critically think on it. Also, when speaking with young filmmakers or folks working to establish a film industry there, we discussed how to be on alert to prevent it from becoming an extractive industry so that it truly serves the local communities and place here. I want to get into my recorded conversation with Salvador, or Sal, but first I want to give an extremely abridged version of Timor's socio-political history, as it all connects to people's lives today, including Sal's life. Evidence of human settlement on the island of Timor dates back at least 40,000 years. Early hunter-gatherers were later joined by migrants from throughout Asia, who introduced agriculture here. Over time, populations became divided into a number of small kingdoms on the island with complex social organization. Both fighting as well as alliances took place between the kinship groups. There's evidence of traders from China and Japan coming here as early as the 13th century, drawn by the island's sandalwood, honey, and wax. In the early 1500s, Europeans began arriving. The western half of the island, or West Timor, was colonized by the Dutch, while East Timor, now known as Timor-Leste, was colonized by the Portuguese. Soon after, the missionaries arrived, spreading the Catholic faith. Today, Timor-Leste is 98% Catholic, and the second highest ratio of Catholic faith in the world, second only to Vatican City. For 400 years, the Portuguese were primarily focused on East Timor for its trade offerings, such as sandalwood, as well as coffee and sugarcane, which they introduced. Due to their focus on trade, Portuguese presence and influence was more concentrated around the coast, so traditional lifestyles continued more so in the mountains and the inland regions. Under Portuguese rule, there were periodic violent clashes as they raised the taxes for locals and used forced labor in the plantations. Portugal put little effort into building up infrastructure in Timor-Leste, including very little healthcare, economic diversity, or education. During World War II, Japan had a brief but violent occupation of East Timor, and by 1945, roughly 50,000 Timorese lost their lives as a result of Japanese occupation and the efforts of the Timorese to resist. Also in 1945, West Timor, which had been a Dutch colony, became part of the Republic of Indonesia. In the 1970s, Portugal's left-wing party pressured the country to withdraw itself from its colonies worldwide. In 1975, Timor-Leste declared themselves independent from hundreds of years of Portuguese colonization. A mere 9 days later, the Indonesian military forcefully invaded. This began a 24-year, pretty violent occupation of Indonesia within Timor-Leste. During those 24 years, Timorese resistance fighters strategized and engaged in guerrilla warfare. In the 24 years of this occupation, which ended only recently in 1999, around 200,000 Timorese, including women and children, lost their lives in fighting, massacres, or forced starvation. Much of the direct violence was carried out by pro-Indonesian militias, which were groups of armed civilians made up of both Timorese citizens from East Timor and Indonesians from West Timor. These militias were trained by the Indonesian National Armed Forces to patrol and carry out official orders of the Indonesian government and military. Much of the world turned a blind eye to this violent occupation, including the U.S. government, who continued to supply arms to Indonesia throughout this time, which were used for the occupation. We'll share more on this time period and the journey to independence throughout this episode. I want to underscore that this episode aims to show the beauty and strength of Timor-Leste and its people, but there are realistic hardships that have taken place here, so a warning that there will be mentions of violence and casualties. We'll now hear from a conversation I had with Salvador, or Sal, on my last day in Timor-Leste. He was gracious enough to give me his time to share for this podcast about his life, his country, and why he works so hard to bring film and storytelling tools to Timor-Leste. Sal begins by speaking about his experience as a child in the 90s, in the last decade of the Indonesian occupation of Timor-Leste.
I had a kind of simple family. My parents didn't have a decent job, but only as a school security. So we eat what we can find on the table. And after working hour, my dad and my mom, they will go to our farm just to plant anything that we can so that we can kind of generate income to the family. As a kid, I didn't realize that. But as I grew up, I noticed that they fought a lot just for us to survive, because at the time it was during Indonesian times We didn't have like much opportunity. We didn't travel much to Delhi because your movement was limited by the people who occupied the country at the time. And then my dad he spent most of his time at schools, so he knew that education is the only key, for you to be succeed.
In 1999, after 24 years of Indonesian occupation, a referendum was held, or a public vote, to determine if East Timor should be an independent nation or to continue under Indonesia. Not all Timorese people wanted independence from Indonesia. And leading up to the referendum vote, pro-Indonesian militias sparked acts of violence and destruction. Sal says as a warning to the people, as if to show that Indonesia creates stability for East Timor, and if you want to vote for independence, this is a taste of the chaos that will ensue. The United Nations came in to oversee the referendum. 78% of the Timorese population voted for independence. The results immediately sparked violence, led by the pro-Indonesian militias. In the clashes before and after the referendum, about 1,400 Timorese civilians are believed to have died, and 75% of the infrastructure in East Timor was destroyed. Sal speaks about this time here.
There was a very chaos, happening in the country, like people burning the house, people taking somebody's life, and everything that you could imagine, it happens there. And my dad, he rented a car from Indonesia just to take us to Indonesia in Atambua, West Timor. And because my dad, he could speak very good Indonesian, and also he works for school as well, and he got a job there as a part-time worker. And then we got a bit of money, but we could not go to schools because everything was burned down. Our school's documents and everything that we could bring, we could not save that. We stayed there for 6 months, and my dad said that, no, we cannot survive here. We have to go back home. And then when we came, everything was not there. Our house was gone, our farm was gone, everything. We had to start everything from zero. And sometimes we only ate once a day. We only eat at night. We have to survive until the breakfast and the lunch. My dad realized that if we stay together, we will not, how can I say, face the life. So he sent me to stay with my elder sister, because at the time she was working as a prison officer, but with a very minimum salary that only can buy food. And then he sends my brother and my sister to stay with my auntie so that they can support us to go to school. But my younger brother, we cannot save him because he got malaria after we got independence, because the hospitals and everything, the clinic was not there. And then I learned a lot. As a 10-year-old kid, I moved to my sister. I was crying all night because I said, oh my God, why I have to move from my parents?
In 2002, 3 years after the referendum vote for independence, East Timor became Timor-Leste and held its first democratic election. Then began the process of building up this sovereign nation.
Luckily, I didn't give up at the time. And I stayed with my sister for 3 years, and I was good at school. And I finished my junior high school, and I told my sister that I want to go to Delhi. My sister said, no, you cannot go.
But Sal worked to get good grades in middle school and was able to get into the Catholic high school in the capital city of Dili, a couple hours' drive from his parents' and sister's home.
I found church as a way for me to escape, because I could meet my friends, I could meet the people that I think we are on the same wavelength, we can talk. And then in the church, I learned about theater. And the priests there, they usually during the church event, they will ask us to perform. That was the first time for me to say, oh, this is theater, we can make people laugh. And I was in love with theater. And I said, oh my God, I think this is what I think that I like to do. But when I moved to Dili, I didn't continue with theater. But deep down, I said that I have, the heart of art, that I can still do it one day.
Sal's brother lived in Dili and worked as a taxi driver, making minimum wage, so he didn't have much money. But he was able to help Sal with his fees for the high school. But Sal says how things were tight financially.
One of the teachers, he noticed me that sometimes I didn't have breakfast, but she said that you're really good, and I think I found someone to sponsor you. And then I would like to go to university, But my parents, they said, no, we didn't have money. And I studied English for 8 months. And then there was an advertising on TV say that, we were looking for actors and actresses, to be on our first soap opera, Timor-Leste. I said, I used to be so good at theater. Maybe this is the time for me now. I have to go do the auditions. And the line was really, really long. So I have to queue for hours, just to sit the auditions. When I was there, I passed, the first phase. And then the second selections, and then the third selection, and the fourth selection, and the final selection. They said, this is the final selections and everything. And I said, oh my God, hopefully I got it. I always pray like that. After waiting for a few weeks, and they called me that, you've been selected. Please come to the office and sign a contract. And everyone in the family, they cried because, everyone in the family, we were crying because they finally have someone, to support the family. Because my brother, he has, 4 children at the time already. And then my sister, she was jobless. And also my parents, they didn't have any job. My dad, he started to work as a teacher, but as a volunteer, like no payment for 10 years. So I was one of the best hopes, for the family. Because I signed a contract with a salary at the time in 2009, per month I got like $700, but that was a lot, at the time. So every month, I can only spend, I will only spend, $100, and the rest will be for my family, my brothers, my sisters, and everyone. And on my second year of working as an actor, I got a role as a main actor. The show is now on YouTube called Sukuhali.
Sal wanted to pursue a degree in film production, but there was nothing like that offered in the country. He went through a rigorous application process to apply for a scholarship to the University of New Zealand, which has a film program that he wanted to participate in.
I thought that entering into film school is easy. Actually, it's not. And after I got a scholarship, but it's not guaranteed that I get a spot in the film schools. So they asked me to send my portfolio. I didn't have any portfolio because I was an actor at the time. And I just sent my acting skills, the film that I was part of. And they said that, we cannot give you a spot in to study film, but you can study acting. And I debated with them. I didn't want to study acting. I would like to become someone behind the camera. Because if you give me the opportunity, I will become the pilot, the role model for other Timorese people who like to study films. And then after weeks, they send me a notification that, congratulations, you're qualified to study film at film schools. And I was so happy because film school, they only qualify 45 people every year to study film.
Sal earned his degree in film and stayed in New Zealand for a little bit afterwards to work in the film industry there, with his work focused in the camera department. In 2016, he returned home to Timor-Leste.
And then I got home, but I didn't find any job, Lara, because you were here for a week and you noticed the film industry here. I can say it's not moving, it's only very slowly. So I was jobless for a while, and then I went back to my mom. I said, Mom, I have no money left in my pocket. And my mom, she has like a $100 bill. She said that this is the last money that I save, for our food. And I got the money. I told myself that I will not come back to see you until I get the money. And then I got to Dili and I started that's why when you explain about don't wait for the opportunity to come, you have to go out there and find it.
Sal is referring to something I said in a workshop to a group of aspiring filmmakers, as I shared my own experience of moving from a small town in rural Montana to the city of Boston, and then later to the city of Los Angeles, with the goal of working in the camera department for film and television. Through cold calls and constant hustling, I was able to establish myself as a camera operator in documentary and narrative productions, and I was based in LA for 10 years before I decided I missed the mountains too much and moved home to Montana. Sal says how he hustled himself and approached organizations around Timor-Leste to see if they were in need of film or video production. He decided to start his own production company. At first it was just him, and then he brought in a partner, and they worked to produce videos for local organizations, doing it for whatever the organization could afford, typically on a very low budget. Over the past few years, Sal and his team have been able to grow their production company, Timorese Film Production, and firmly establish themselves as a leader in Timor-Leste's film production services. Sal still hustles and wears many hats. Along with doing all stages of production under his own company, he sometimes works as a translator. He also works for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who has a permanent presence in Timor-Leste. Sal works for them as a trainer, training Timorese people for positions both in front of and behind the camera. Here is Sal.
I could say that now I'm financially stable now. I could support my nieces and nephews because I have like 15 or 16 of them, and they are hungry for educations. Most of them, when they finish their study in Ermera, they will come to Dili, and I will provide them like with food and also the school fee. And here I am now. I can say that I'm very happy. That's why your presentation inspired me a lot, Lara. You say that I have all the skills, but it's best to share so that I have like more perspective. And that's what I'm doing now, because it proves that education can change someone's life. It proves like it happens to me, and I would like them to feel the same. Like no matter where you're from, if you study hard, if you get educations, it doesn't mean that you have to go to fancy school, public school, but if you study hard, you can get what you want.
Obrigada, thank you so much for sharing that. Truly inspiring. And I think for other people all over the world, it's inspiring. I'm wondering if you could say your perspective on that concept of just knowing that an opportunity exists. So like a lot of what you and I have been talking about with younger groups, it's just sharing that there are opportunities to work in the film industry, that film industry is a career path. And I think for some places that might have a more established film industry, they might take that for granted, that just knowing that that's an option is a big deal. And just if there's something that you want to share about that, or things you've seen in your experience of working with younger people, and kind of what you've seen open up for people once it's about introducing the opportunity.
Working with you has inspired me a lot. Especially the things that sometimes we notice the kids here, our youngsters, they don't spend much time to do a research, to do things that they love the most. Timorese people are very talented, but what kind of like stopping a lot of young people to not express what they want is from the family. Because like growing up, we always have someone to say that you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you have to stop this. If you make mistake, your parents or your caregivers will scold you to say that you are worthless, you cannot do this, you cannot do anything. So it kind of like affects them, because it linger on them, it stays with them. Last week when we were in America, one of the school students would like to ask questions, and then everyone was laughing at him because they said that, your question is not enough. This is one of the things that we face a lot in the family, not only in the family, in the community. That's one of the things, one of the reasons why it stops, young people not to find opportunities.
Sal says another element that prevents folks from pursuing paths that may be their true passion or interest is, since Timor-Leste is only 2 decades old as an independent nation, many people focus on a job that directly applies to development, such as engineering or teaching. As Sal says, a more linear job with a stable 9-to-5 schedule. Not like the film industry, which is notoriously fluid and unpredictable. The day before this conversation with Sal, he and I visited with the director of the Fundación Oriente, a center where we hosted some of the workshops. This center provides training and sponsorship for local artisans to develop their craft. But the director said that in Timor-Leste, the reality is that many talented artists, including filmmakers, leave their craft and talent behind to pursue things that allow them to survive, to put food on the table, as the economy is such here that artists are not always financially compensated for their work, so they leave it behind to become a cab driver or a cleaner. Or if they can pull together the means to leave the country, they pursue an opportunity that way. Sal continues here about an added barrier to pursue these things, with family pressures.
If you have a strict parents, you have to study what they want, not what you want. Either you study and they support you, or you leave the house and do what you want.
Sure.
So it also stops, young people to do what they love the most. It doesn't mean that we don't have like young people, who like to do films.
There's a lot of talent.
A lot of
too.
talent, yeah. But that's why this kind of workshop, this kind of training is very useful. By bringing you here, by having you here, they can at least, see the outside world. And that's why I say, like when we had our first meeting, I said that, Lara, if you can talk much about your experience, that will inspire them a lot.
I also mentioned to Sal here that it's important to show that film production is not a fluff position, that as Timor-Leste is in the process of building up different sectors, health, culture, education, infrastructure, environmental stewardship, etc., that film is in fact an integral part of all of those sectors. Public awareness is necessary with all of those things, and film and video is a key tool to share that awareness. It's a medium to inspire and share ideas, and has the power to document and shape the Timorese identity, past, present, and future. Sal and I discussed something that we shared during the workshops, that from the outside, many may only see film production as the actors or the superficial positions. But those of us who work in the industry know how much skilled labor is required behind the scenes. From camera and lighting technicians, to electricians, to carpenters, truck drivers, landscapers, cooks, location managers, the list goes on. One commercial or film shoot can employ anywhere from 5 people to hundreds of people on a single production. And in a smaller film market such as Timor-Leste, there may not be enough work to make a living only working on film productions. So young people get discouraged and quit it altogether. So Sal and I shared with folks how you can pursue other careers such as a teacher or electrician, but then transfer these skills to work on a film production when an opportunity arises. In the workshops, we also spoke a lot about how to incorporate the power of story and video into any profession, from health to science to simply being human, to create positive action. Sal and I switched gears in our conversation. As Sal was a young child in the 90s, in the last decade of the Indonesian occupation, I asked him if he's up for sharing about what he perceived of the situation at that time. In the previous week, when Sal and Ratna and I drove up into the mountains in Sal's home municipality of Ermera, he would share memories or stories from that time period. Sometimes he shared relatable childhood memories of shortcuts through the woods or places he would play with his friends. Other times he was pointing out a spot along the mountain road where resistance informants were killed at the hands of Indonesian military or pro-Indonesian militias. Tragically, he shared an account of it happening to one of his relatives. These were things I did not deliberately ask or press him about, but that he shared forthright. In this recorded conversation, I did not take this lightly to bring it up with Sal, and I more so meant to just open the door if he wanted to share anything of his perspective during that time. Because during our car rides, it did seem he wanted to share about it, to get the messages out there. Here is Sal.
I didn't have much memory, but things that I can remember at the time was like my dad. We can say that he has 2 faces. During daytime, he will work for Indonesia as a school security, but at night time, in our house, we will gather, resistance from the jungle.
The Timorese resistance to the Indonesian occupation was largely led by people who were considered guerrilla soldiers, and they largely organized from discrete locations in the jungle. So what Sal is speaking about here is that sometimes his dad would host these resistance fighters in their home.
During that time, they didn't have much food to eat. So they rely heavily on families, community that will provide them supplies and food. And at night time, our dad will whisper to us that whatever you see, whatever you hear from here, stays here.
Sal says that Indonesian families lived in their neighborhood, and sometimes Sal and his siblings would play with the children of these families. He shares that his father was nervous of what the kids would innocently share with one another.
My dad always afraid that if we say anything that we're supposed to not say, that hey, last night we have like people like a couple of guys with curly hair and afro, wearing a military uniform in our house, my dad will be punished or he will die for that. But we heard a gunfire during the elections because when the result came out, the pro-Indonesian, they didn't accept that, the militias.
When Sal refers to the militias here, he's referring to the pro-Indonesian militias, who carried out much of the direct violence leading up to and after the vote for independence. Sal says that from their perspective as kids, when they saw the militias in their neighborhood, they just saw men seemingly parading through the streets. So he and his peers would sometimes tag along, walking alongside them.
We see the militias on the streets, we will go to them. And we'll kind of walk with them because they didn't.
For a kid, it's not separated, right?
Separate. Yeah. But I could see, from my parents' eyes and their face, we can see, now I feel it now. When you are kind of in a situation where you can lose your life, the face is changed. But you didn't notice that at the time. I didn't feel it, Laura, until I reached 21. So everything kind of struck back. The gunfire, I could not watch, the war films, because everything kind of
the reality
coming back.
Yeah.
And it affected my study because I was in New Zealand already. And I had to go see counseling because I could not sleep at night. We call it
PTSD?
PTSD. Yeah. I could not watch war movie. I could not hear gunfire, and I didn't want to hear story that related to war or anything. I could not sleep at night, and sometimes I cry. For no reason. And I had to see the counseling, and then when I went in the room, he said that, say anything that you like to say to me. I'm gonna be a good listener. And I will start with I miss my family. I miss my childhood. I miss my country. I miss everything in my country. Because in that situation, Lara, you just want to be close to your family.
Connect.
Yeah, you connect. I just want to go home. And then she says something. Do you believe in any religion? I say, yeah, I'm Catholic. Okay, pray at night. And do you play any sport? I say, yeah, I play football. Yeah, play football. And it helps me. But it's not helping me 100%. Lara.
Sure.
Even until now. Sometimes you notice in the car, if I could not talk this topic too much regarding Indonesian time, anything, it's kind of automatically. And also it affects me a lot when we were here and I lost my brother. We are very close. I was 8 years old and he was 6 or 7 years old.
Again, Sal's brother passed away at a young age from malaria as the chaos of the times led to poor conditions for healthcare here. Here again is Sal.
We play every day together, very close. Wow. It's like twins. And I lost him, and then everything came back. Now I cannot listen to the sad song because it will remind me of my brother, my childhood, the gunfire. Although at the time I didn't feel anything, Lara. But now everything's kind of come back.
Sure.
Yeah, you cannot sometimes you feel good and sometimes you feel not good. And sometimes you question yourself that, am I normal? It was really bad, Lara. And now, even until now, although we have everything that we can have it, not as good as in Western countries, but at least we can survive. We can eat 3 times a day. We have shelters.
Sure, yeah.
And if you like to travel to Indonesia, you can. If you like to travel to Australia, you can. You can do whatever you want because we are an independent country now. But the scars, still here.
Today, many Indonesians still live in Timor-Leste. Many Timorese live in Indonesia. They're often neighbors and friends with one another, and relations with the Indonesian government seem to be productive. I asked Sal what that dynamic is like between Indonesians, Timorese, and even Portuguese that still live together in this country, with both the wounds of the Indonesian occupation and Portuguese colonization being so fresh and relatively recent. Now, of course, everyone here is going to have their own individual views and ways of processing. But Sal explains to me that he sees a general sentiment that ever since Timor-Leste held its first democratic election in 2002, the Timorese government and public have made an effort to move forward while being honest about the wrongs that took place. Sal explains how the violence was initiated by the Indonesian government and military leadership of that time. So why would they hold grudges towards the Indonesian civilians? Also, as Indonesia is a multi-island nation in close proximity to Timor-Leste, and West Timor is actually part of Indonesia, they've resolved that they need a functioning relationship with Indonesia. A key reasoning to this stance, Sal explains, ties back to Timor-Leste being 98% Catholic, and that many take very seriously that forgiveness is a foundational pillar of Christianity. Now, of course, it's complex, and not everyone feels this way. And it also doesn't mean the wrongdoings get swept under the rug. Quite the opposite. That reconciliation and memorialization of those events seems to be very important. Back to my conversation with Sal.
It's not always easy, Laura, especially if you have experience, a country who invaded your country and then limited your movements, and then we lost most of our best people, young people, very potential leader during that time. It was really hard. But Timor-Leste is, like we can say, the vast majority of people are Catholic. So in Catholic, one thing that teaches us is like forgiveness. That's one of the way that you can live happily. Because if you keep hatred in your heart, you will not sleep at night. Everything for you is like bad. But if you keep peace in your heart, by forgive people, sometimes it's hard, you can kind of move on with your life happily. We adopt that belief that by only forgiveness we can live like peacefully between us and Indonesia, although the experience for us was not as good. That's why when we got independence, the first thing we did was to establish the CAVR, the commissions that focus on reconciliations. They produce a lot of videos, they produce also a lot of documentaries to talk about people who suffer at the times, but both ways, from Timor side and West side. One of the reasons why we have to forgive is like, at the end of the day, during Indonesian times, Timorese people fought each other.
Sal is referring to the fact that the pro-Indonesian militias included Timorese people who did not want to be independent from Indonesia.
There was like a difference between leaders in 1975. That's why Indonesia invaded. Because some leaders thought that, we want Indonesia. And some leaders, no, we have to get independent. And they...
So from the beginning, it was kind of fighting. Okay.
If we didn't forgive them, means that we didn't forgive our brothers and sisters who are now in West Indonesia. They cannot come here because they committed a crime in Timor-Leste. But for us, they're still our brothers. And that's why we have like a theory of like nahabiti bot, means that we have like long big mattress. So you have to like put it on floor and everyone sits there, talk. And apologize. Apologize is the one of the principles that we use here.
And has that been happening?
Yes, in 2000 and 2001, 2002.
The Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation, which formed when Timor-Leste gained independence 25 years ago, posts its findings and documents its process publicly, and it's all available online.
That's why our leaders now, the president, he say that we are friends of everyone, because we've been living in a misery or like conflict for a long time now.
Sure.
There is no point, having an enemy, because you're at the end of the day you are just an island.
Sure.
And Indonesia is huge country, big country, and by reconciling you can move on. Don't worry. Although a lot of people still against that. Some people still against. It's not like everyone, Lara. This is like only my perspective and only my idea.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because I think too, it's like in the States, there's been obviously a lot of, and still is a lot of harm and wrongdoing to certain groups of people. And often with the conversation about we need to move on, we need to move forward, to a lot of people that means we don't talk honestly about the past, right? We don't talk about the things that are hard to talk about, right? It's just like, let's move on, let's keep going. But I'm hoping that, like what you're saying of the process, that it's not one or the other, right? That we can find a way to have peace and move forward, but it doesn't mean we don't talk honestly about reality, right, or the history.
Yeah, because Lara, not all Indonesians fought Timor-Leste at the time. Only people who were at the time, who part of the government at the time, who against Timor-Leste. These people nowadays, my age nowadays, they don't know anything about that.
Sure.
Because they were not part of the government at the time. Yeah, that's why I say it's good that we move on, but it doesn't mean that we cannot talk about that. The story exists, and we will keep talking about that.
To wrap up my conversation with Sal, I ask him if he has any messages or thoughts that he wants to share for young people of Timor-Leste in regards to the importance of sharing their story and voice, or about his continued efforts to help grow the film industry here.
Yeah, I would like to say, Lara, I would like to borrow one of the words you say, collaboration. You say that in Montana, because Montana, the film industry is now start to grow. So all the community, filmmaker community, kind of helping each other. Timor-Leste, we need to use, the same method, the same system in order for us, to go further. We have to work together. And also, the youngster nowadays are pretty much different with my time. What I say 10 years back. At the time, we were hunger for opportunities, like educations. But the youngsters nowadays, they don't take educations more seriously. I'm not saying that all the youngsters in Timor-Leste. Some of the youngsters in Timor-Leste, they don't consider education is the key to change the world. They pretty much don't go out look for opportunities. They just stay at home and then wait for opportunities to come. If we keep doing the same things, we are not going anywhere. In filmmaking, the best way you can do is go out, make friends, and talk to people. Because by talking to people, you learn a lot. In the future, I'll hope to see more filmmakers, but not only in Dili, but in all municipalities. Another thing is my message to the young people here also, to consider other areas that can contribute economy to the country. And as your presentation you mentioned, the film industry also can drive, economy to the country. Now everyone, even our government, is focusing on development, infrastructure. In the next 20 years, imagine if we have achieved everything. Okay, our people, now they have to, we have to entertain them. Now we have a lot of Indonesian channels in the country. Maybe in the next 20 years, our children, they decided, no, we don't want Indonesian movie anymore, mom or dad. I would like to watch Timor-Leste movie. But we cannot wait until 20 years and we start everything. We have to start from now. They consider filming is one of the ways, as you say, to change, to break stereotype, to change community, to bring Timor-Leste to the world, to bring Timor-Leste culture, Timor-Leste story, Timor-Leste tourism, Timor-Leste people, to the world by filming.
One of the things that Sal and his filmmaking peers in Timor-Leste are doing to elevate the film industry here is to educate, to lead workshops and trainings for young people and locals of all ages to learn about different departments of film production, from production design to technician work, to writing, producing, directing, and everything in between.
It's a hard work. It's a hard work, Lara. Sure. But I'm gonna keep fighting and produce more people, youngster. I hope that I'm very sure that things that I'm doing I'm gonna enjoy it one day by seeing them. Producing more films.
Endless gratitude to Sal for his hospitality in hosting me in his country, for his partnership, his friendship, and for sharing with me. I also want to share about a favorite day for me in Timor-Leste, where we spent the afternoon at the home of Sal's family. While we were in the municipality of Ermera to teach a workshop at a high school there, we drove to his family's small farm high on the ridgeline of a jungled mountain, in and even above the clouds. It was supposed to be a quick hello, but to my joy, it turned into a visit around cups of fresh coffee, then a walkabout, then a cooking lesson, then a full lunch, another coffee, and much laughter, despite language barriers. Ermera is Timor-Leste's main coffee-growing region, which, as I mentioned, coffee is the country's largest agricultural export. And I can attest, it's incredible coffee. Although Starbucks does own a large coffee farm in the mountains here, the rest of the supply is largely local farmers who have smaller operations, sometimes for export and sometimes for sustenance or local sales. Sal's family's place is actually one of these local coffee farms, and all of the coffee in Ermita seem to be shade-grown. When I've seen coffee farms in other countries, it's usually in an open area with uniform rows of the crop, meaning that the forest likely had to be clear-cut for the coffee to be grown there. But as we drove up the windy mountain roads to Ermita, the only vegetation that I could see was dense jungle. I would have never known that coffee plants were much of the understory if Sal hadn't pulled the car over and pointed out the coffee plants in bloom, growing in the shade of the towering eucalyptus and palm trees. The complexities of the forest ecosystem remained, and the crop still grew. I pictured the tragedy of what would be if clear-cutting took place here to grow the coffee. Not only the collapse of this ecosystem and the animals and insects and birds that it was home to, but the cooling effect that this forest brought to the region, the drought that it prevented, the way that the presence of this jungle contributed to water and rain cycles. And as the rainy season can be so intense here, and mudslides already a major issue, without the intricate root system that the forest creates, mudslides would be tenfold in frequency and devastation. Another interesting thing that Sal pointed out while we were driving through the mountains were the various temple buildings, or worship houses, all different sizes and styles, some freshly under construction. Sal said those were to practice the native religions and worships that dated back before the Portuguese colonization. The Portuguese forbid these practices in support of Catholicism, but enough Timorese people continued to practice it discreetly or in secret that the culture carried on to the present day. And now they're free to practice this freely, so new temples are even popping up. And Catholic practice is still 98% of the population here, but many people practice both methods of worship. Back to my visit with Sal's family at their hillside farm. Sal and his uncle gave me a tour of their garden behind the home. Sustenance for the family, the freshest grocery source you could ask for. There were fruit trees, various chili peppers, sweet potatoes, medicinal plants, and so much more, all growing in a way where each plant was serving and benefiting from the plant growing next to it, resembling more of a forest ecosystem than a cultivated garden. And there was a great deal of cassava, a root tuber similar to a yam or sweet potato. Sal's brother-in-law showed me what to look for to know when the root is ready to harvest. Then his family and Ratna gave me a lesson in how to properly peel the root, which my clumsy newbie speed was embarrassing, next to their swift cuts. The root was then boiled and served with another cup of phenomenal coffee, which was also grown and roasted right there at their farm by the family. Sal told me how for centuries the people of Timor-Leste were always a, quote, root-eating people, with cassava being one of the most efficient sources of carbs, energy, and nutrients, compared to most any other food. It was the Indonesian occupation that made rice the more common staple here, but cassava and other tuber vegetables are still key for local diets. He said how when his dad would go to work the coffee grove, they would have only cassava root in their pocket and a thermos of coffee and be good for the day. Walking through his family's dynamic garden, I thought of how much my mom would love to see it, as she has always worked her tail off to create a sustenance garden for our family. I hope to host Sal in Montana and show him my mother's garden. This afternoon with Sal's family, of food, hands in the soil, laughter, and of course a good cup of coffee, were all vessels of universal human connection. I now want to share some about the workshops I led with Sal and Ratna. As I mentioned, we put on 14 workshops with 15 to 40 people in each session, ranging from high school age to mid-20s for the most part. I shared about my own work in film, different positions people could pursue in the industry, and also the general power of elevating story through video, photo, and audio storytelling to create calls to action and advocacy, regardless of their professional path. Sal and I would then do hands-on training of basics with camera, microphones, lighting, and have the workshop attendees practice being in different roles, such as director, cinematographer, and so on. One of the groups we led a workshop for is called Girls Out Loud, Timor-Leste. This volunteer collective of teens and young women aim to empower women and girls in Timor-Leste and bring awareness to the importance of gender equality. As they informed me, there are extreme gaps in women versus men in the workplace and societal roles. It was an honor to learn from these young women and share with them some tools of video to utilize in their advocacy efforts, or maybe to spark an interest to pursue a career in the field. Sal told me that regardless of these girls' chosen career path, sometimes just the optics of seeing a woman working in a male-dominated field can have benefits. I've spent my professional career largely working in the camera and lighting department of film and television. This technical, labor-intensive field has long been somewhat of a boys' club, and thanks to the women who have paved the way for decades, I'm grateful to see so many more women in this field than even 10 years ago. Most film sets I worked on before that, I was used to being the only female on a camera lighting department of maybe 30 or more people. And I'm grateful to have always had respectful male peers and teachers. But it was the handful of women in the field that I looked up to that reminded me that I belong there. Optics and representation does matter. Some of my favorite moments giving these workshops in Timor-Leste was seeing young women take ownership in their role behind the camera. Some really honed it quickly, with a humble fierceness, and I could easily picture them working as a cinematographer in the future. They have the power to share stories from their perspective, literally through their eyes. And if they don't pursue a career in film or media, it was powerful to observe the moments where they may have been shy to step in at first, but when I urged them to take their turn behind the camera, a spark of confidence was visible. I thank these young women for teaching and inspiring me as they dedicate themselves to improve the lives of their communities. Another advocacy group we worked with was Laudato Si, Movement Timor-Leste, which is a young volunteer group focusing on climate change awareness and climate action advocacy. Here is a member of the group, Claudia, who is a student at the National University of Timor.
Right now we focus on how to we adapt on the climate change. Right now we make a training for all youth who want to be part of our group, and then make a seminar for the people to raise awareness from the climate change impact right now.
Along with these public awareness campaigns about climate impacts, Claudia said they are organizing beach cleanup days and tree planting. I asked Claudia, what are the evident impacts of climate change in Timor-Leste? She says the sea level rise is visibly noticeable, especially as it is an island, so there is a lot of coastal development. And she also says that the summer brings more intense drought, and the rainy season brings more intense monsoons, not only bringing damaging flooding to places like the city of Dili, but it impacts agriculture and growing cycles throughout the country.
Normally, we start the raining in the November until February. But nowadays, it looks like until June still raining. This affect for especially for the agriculture is their production is not really good rice. So
Okay.
Yeah.
So not as good production when it's raining a lot.
Raining a lot. So, especially in the capital, in the Delhi, when the intensity of the raining ups is make flooding.
And how did you and the group, how did you learn about climate change? Like, are you learning about it in school, just online, different ways that you have learned about impacts of climate change?
Actually, we learn from the school. We have the climatology, there's a little bit from the school, from the university, but the most we learn from our groups, like the founder in our group, like they invite all the experts in the climate change, for example, adaptation, mitigation. They all like invite them to speak for us. Like we have the discussion when they present and they will listen, or they present something and then we listen, and then after that we have decision Q&A, like we make discussion.
And do you have a message you want to put out there for other young people in Timor-Leste?
My message is as a young, you have to contribute to raise up our awareness for the climate change, because we are the generation of this country. So we start from now to prepare our planet or our common home to be good. So what do we plant now, and then we are collecting for the future.
Thank you to Claudia for speaking with me. Here now is a clip from the workshop with this group, Laudato Si. I asked them questions about their group and the reality of climate conversations in Timor-Leste. They say that many people here notice and talk about the changes that they're seeing, but the group members say that folks don't always realize that what they're observing is actually an impact of climate change. Here I ask them a question, and a group member answers in Tetun. Then Sal comes in with the English translation. And I'm wondering just what are methods that you use to share the messages? You know, is it conversation, talking with people, video, writing? What mediums they use?
Only the name cover íamos formação, íamos video, formação nesse around biasanya until training
Different type of like methods to socialize, the informations. The first one we use, pretty much we started with the online training, or online workshop, so that we raise, the awareness of people. And also we also did video on how to raise an awareness on climate change. And also we also did the recycling, because sometimes people say that you just talk a lot, but you zero actions. So that's why we kind of did also the recycling. And if we cannot do that, we take it, to the Caltech. It's a company for recycling. Huge company here that focusing on recycling.
As it is around the world, including in the U.S., trash, plastic pollution, and general waste is a problem. Most items now are imported here to Timor-Leste from the global food supply. So food packaging is rampant, including plastic bottles, as most people here rely on bottled water. As an island nation, space is limited for waste disposal, so much of the trash is burned, creating toxic air pollution. Along some stretches of the coastline, there were dense sprawls of plastics and trash, sometimes ankle deep. And I know much of this trash along the coastline is not from this country at all, but actually washed up from around the world on ocean currents. I've seen this in some of the most remote places around the world, in regions where there's no trace of humans, not even a trail or a road. But then you see piles of waste strewn along the shoreline, shoes, food packaging, plastic bottles galore, and even larger things like washing machines, washed up from hurricanes that happened in distant countries. In Timor-Leste, I was fortunate to go on a scuba dive with Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy and Department of State, Diana Braunschweig. The dive was led by local dive shop, Dreamers Dive Academy, and one of the local dive guides, Tequila, was speaking with me about the trash situation there, explaining that the litter is an education issue, how for thousands of years, society here relied on food that was grown here or unprocessed. So the extent of food packaging were peels or palm leaves that compost when you toss them on the ground. Then, when plastics and processed foods were introduced in the 1960s and onwards, they didn't come with a public information campaign about this new concept of non-compostable packaging. In the U.S., until a few decades ago, when public information campaigns clarified things, it was common for people to throw bottles and food wrappers directly out of the car window without a second thought. Another group that we worked with to teach about video for advocacy is the Rotaract Club, similar to the Rotary clubs in the U.S., but with all youth and young adult membership. There are 7 Rotaract clubs throughout Timor-Leste, and they focus on different civic duties depending on the needs of their community. I spoke with Camilla and Flaudio, who are both of university age, at the Rotaract Club chapter in Dili. Camilla had a focus on working with young girls to read in both Tetun language and in English. Literacy rates in Timor-Leste were 69% in 2020, up from 57% in 2010. One reason for these rates of literacy is in the destruction that took place during the struggle for independence from Indonesia. Many schools were completely destroyed, setting education back for at least a generation. Women and girls here have lower literacy rates than males, and Camilla is working to change that. She shares with me about the mission of the Rotaract Club here.
So Rotaract Club is a club that accumulates of youth people that have a spirit of volunteerism to do something for the country. For an example, beach cleanup, English for kids, for the children, and reading clubs to improve our reading skills.
Camilla tells me about her focus area here, teaching in a neighborhood of Dili that has high poverty rates, and therefore less opportunity for education.
So the most interesting part for me was teaching English for kids. I once was teaching in Komoro for the kids in there. So as we see from the kids, make us feel like they deserve the same education as others. So that's part so touched me.
What do you think, for Dili municipality at least, what do you think are some of the greatest needs for the communities here?
I think action that make Dili better is from ourselves. For an example, you make things better when you do first. So you make example for them. For an example, go to Rotary Club. In there, you can learn more about what things that we need. You can search your passion and start it from yourself.
Search your passion and start from yourself. Great advice. Flaudio, the other young Rotaract Club member I was speaking with, has a focus on the arts. He shares how the arts, from poetry to film, can be a tool for advocacy, as well as the value in using the arts to share about the country's culture and identity.
Not just about how to promote our history, our identity, but also we can make a change for the community. Like now we have planned to make like movies about environment and social issues in Timor-Leste. We can change people's mind to see the problem that right now we face.
Flaudio says some of these environmental and social issues include impacts of climate change, littering and waste, developing sustainable economies, literacy, and gender equality. I asked Camilla what are ways that she hopes to use story to share messages with people of Timor-Leste.
The story that I want to tell is how to take an action for a small thing. For an example, self-confidence. You can take an action to speak up or to share your ideas or to fight the stereotype, as you mentioned, or fight some stigma or fight something that really makes you so down. Small progress is still a progress. So keep it up and do whatever you feel like it will make a better to our country or our community. Just trust in yourself and be yourself.
I asked them both about stigmas around certain topics, how we can't address what we aren't talking about. So if there are any topics that they wish were spoken about more openly. Camilla said that the topic of girl and female empowerment sticks out to her.
Girls like us go to some volunteer activities, but we contribute our mindset to make a better country. So,
thank you to Camilla and Flaudio for sharing with me, and to the Rotaract Club members for the work they volunteer to do to benefit their communities. The last person we'll hear from is Roger Cal Guzmanes, who is a lead at the Centro Audiovisual Max Stahl, Timor-Leste. I'll just refer to it as the Center from here on out. The center was initiated and named for Max Stahl, who was a British journalist who came to Timor-Leste in the last decade of the Indonesian occupation. As I am passionate about the power of elevating story, especially through visual documentation, Max's involvement in this period of history greatly interested me. Here is an excerpt from a documentary film we were shown at the center of Max Stahl himself, speaking to the approach of the Timorese resistance fighters that he was observing.
And the whole situation became a struggle which was motivated not by a commander saying do this or do that, but by a kind of grassroots sense of what was needed and what should be done.
The Indonesian occupation began in 1975, and for the next couple of decades, the world outside of Timor-Leste was not really paying attention to the atrocities taking place here, partially due to it not being publicized on international media, and partially due to foreign governments, including the U.S., turning a blind eye to what was happening here. But in 1991, shortly after journalist Max Stahl arrived in East Timor to document the occupation, something happened that forced the world to pay attention. Following the killing of a prominent member of the resistance, Sebastian Gomez, there was a peaceful protest of hundreds of pro-independence Timorese people at the Santa Cruz Cemetery in Dili. The peaceful protesters were largely young people, university students, but also a mix of general members of the public who wanted independence. Max Stahl was observing and filming this peaceful protest with his camera. Suddenly, violence erupted by the Indonesian military. This event is officially referred to as a massacre, as it was the armed military firing at unarmed civilians who were running for their lives through the cemetery. At least 250 unarmed Timorese people were killed. In the chaos, Max was on the ground in the cemetery, laying between the headstones, filming the atrocity taking place. As militants came towards him, he knew they would seize and destroy his footage. So, thinking fast, he looked around, and next to where he lay was a freshly buried grave, so the topsoil was still soft. Roger shares here about these events, speaking in the Tetun language, with Sal coming in to translate.
Oh yeah, like he hit not the camera but the tape.
Okay.
Because there was somebody who just died, and then he just buried. I mean the grave was still fresh because of the soil and everything, and it's very easy for him. To dig and then he
dirt was soft.
Yes, and
wow.
he hit that there, and then his camera was captured. Wow. By the Indonesian troops, and then he was taken to the Indonesian troops headquarters to investigate him, and for hours and hours of sitting there, and then at night, and then later they released him, and he learned that Indonesian troops are afraid of the ghost. So that instead of going to the cemetery during the daytime, he went there during the nighttime.
Max returned to the Santa Cruz Cemetery at night, knowing the superstitious Indonesian soldiers would not be around then, and he was able to unbury his tapes and found a way to get them smuggled out of the country. As soon as the tapes were made public in international media, there was a shift. From a clip of the documentary, here's Max Stahl describing the global revelation that this footage created.
So here was evidence that you could hardly deny. People being slaughtered in front of the camera. You couldn't deny that stuff. So all these people who wanted to deny it had to face it. They had to answer questions.
This truth that the footage shared with the world prompted questions to be asked, holes to be poked, and for the international community to be held accountable for their silence on what was happening in East Timor. And this ramped up the resistance efforts on the ground here, and eventually led to the referendum, or the public vote, in 1999, for the Timorese people to vote on whether or not they wanted independence. As we mentioned, there was violence and destruction carried out by the pro-Indonesian militias leading up to the referendum to intimidate Timorese into not voting for independence. When the results of the referendum came in, showing that 76% of Timorese voted for independence, Roger speaks here, with Sal translating, about the documentation on video that Max Stahl captured of the joy immediately after the results came in.
Usai hamil 1999, pengen yang mai situação 99, 4 de setembro em era.
When the United Nations announced the result that Timor-Leste would like to get independence, 78%, he used that camera to film the expressions, and you see today people celebrate it and people kind of cheering, crying because of the independence. He used that camera.
Wow. But this joy was short-lived, as the referendum results also sparked a heavy increase in the pro-Indonesian militia violence. Max Stahl narrates via the documentary here about his experience and observations immediately after the results of the vote came in.
I, with the help of my Timorese friends, went up to the Dari, which is the hills behind Dili, and thousands of Timorese ran for the hills during the night. They grabbed their babies, their plastic bags, their bits and pieces, and they scrambled up in pitch black the rocks. There was gunfire, some people were shot that night.
As we mentioned earlier, in this time leading up to and immediately after the referendum vote alone, about 1,400 Timorese civilians were killed, and 75% of the infrastructure in East Timor was destroyed. Max Stahl remained in Timor-Leste and continued to document the process of establishing independence in the first democratic election in 2002. He speaks here via the documentary.
I was privileged to be in a position to record extraordinary events here in Timor. A popular struggle fought not so much with guns but more with ideas and with an extraordinary courage in the ordinary people. And I was aware that this story could also be lost.
Max Stahl was awarded many honors by the Timorese people and government for not only capturing that footage in the cemetery that made the world pay attention to the reality, but also for the ongoing documentation of this time period, leading to their independence as well as the aftermath. This center was created to make sure that this history was not lost and forgotten. They say that their mission is to assist the newly independent Timor-Leste in rediscovering its past and fostering an understanding of its unique cultural heritage, as well as to place the resources of the center at the service of peace and understanding regionally and worldwide. The center now holds all of Max's video footage from his years of documentation, as well as footage from other journalists. In the back half of the center, the video and audio tapes fill endless shelves, floor to ceiling. The center now has teams working to digitize all of the tapes, make transcripts, and translate them all from Tetun and other native languages, Portuguese and Indonesian, into English, French, and other languages.
So Laura, these three computers, they do, one of the hardest jobs. What they do, three of them, they have to do the transcriptions for all the videos. They have done some of it, but in total more than 5,000, they haven't done the transcription yet.
The footage and the documentation is utilized for educational purposes to inform the residents and the world about this time period. Roger says that PhD candidates come here to study the footage for their research, not only Timorese PhD candidates, but also those from around the world. Around 60% of the population of Timor-Leste is under the age of 30, largely due to the mass casualties during the occupation and the upsets that created within their populations. Census and surveys have shown that many Timorese don't know the history of this relatively recent period, so staff and volunteers from the center travel throughout the country visiting schools, including very rural schools that don't have electricity, which is common in rural areas here. The center brings the full setup to these schools, including a generator if they don't have electricity, to be able to show them this short documentary film and share the story of the occupation, the resistance, and the grassroots efforts that led to their nation's independence. On one wall in the center, there were dozens of drawings posted, clearly drawings done by young children. I could see they were depicting a commotion of people in a cemetery. I learned it was actually depicting the 1991 massacre in the Santa Cruz Cemetery. Roger explains here in Tetun, and then Sal comes in to translate.
Sí, sira aprende tamane mak dalruma sira lahatene akar kanto sira narsade. Sira ho gambar de. Ene labar ki kon sira mane kelas 1 2. Sira mak surin.
So these pictures, those are the visitors from first and second grade. Since they don't even know how to write it, they just paint it.
This is of the massacre?
Irene igreja motair.
Yes.
Monumento irene maka estado halo atu fonra ba estudante na indruan nebe maka.
There is a statue built to remember those two men that were helping each other in the cemetery. When you saw like he was holding it, it's like to remember that. But since we tell them the kids the story, and they picture it themselves and they start painting.
It's powerful. The statue, he mentions, is a towering depiction of this moment, of two Timorese men helping each other in the cemetery. And the statue towers over a major roadway in Dili, where much of the daily traffic drives. These things are what I mean when I say that yes, the wounds are recent and difficult, but it's important to them to put it front and center, to be open and honest about it, even with the young people of the country. Roger speaks here, with Sal translating, about other messages that they share with young students.
Ba italav ba fahere historias irene basira conta de historias irene lius filmaden.
Not only do we share them the story about the fight of our country, but we also share to them those who fought at the time who are still alive now, who are still leading the country. We also share the story of brave women who fought for the country, who are now still alive, and those who already passed away, to tell them their contributions to the independence were from different people, including women.
Sal informed me that the Timorese nuns and the priests of the Catholic churches here played key roles in the resistance, smuggling notes and communication secretly to other organizers. The center also holds the audio and visual documentation of the occupation before Max arrived in the country, so beginning in 1975, including the film footage of a group of 5 young Australian journalists who came to be known as the Balibo Five. These young journalists came to East Timor and were here documenting in 1975 and captured the footage of the Indonesians violently invading. These Australian journalists disappeared, and it was later learned that they were killed by the Indonesian military. This story is depicted in a 2009 film titled Balibo. Thank you so much to Roger for opening the doors of the center to us and for educating me. And, of course, thank you to Sal for his translating work. I do want to share about a conversation that Sal and I had while driving to the workshops one morning. As I've mentioned, this country is 98% Catholic. Many Indonesians live in Timor-Leste, and Indonesians are largely Muslim. I asked Sal about these dynamics. Now, of course, there are outliers to this, and I don't mean to generalize, but Sal said that for the most part, the population taps into a public narrative that people can do as they wish as long as they're not harming someone else. Similarly to the LGBTQ community here, I saw signs in the streets showing they were preparing for an upcoming Pride Parade there in Dili. Sal said that while the Catholic Church within Timor-Leste doesn't actively promote it, the church doesn't go out of its way to speak against the community. Sal says it so simply, that the general thought is, if it's not harming anyone, what's the problem? In a way, it really is that simple of a question. And then I think about how around the world, including in the US, how these ideological differences are indeed weaponized against one another, and where a difference in religion or orientation or an intolerance towards difference is the root of so much painful conflict around the world, in a way that unfortunately seems to be increasing. And I don't at all mean to oversimplify the complexities of these conflicts taking place everywhere. It's just an observation that regrounds me to the dynamics of humanity. It makes me wonder if this value of tolerance in Timor-Leste is a symptom of coming out of such a prolonged period of conflict and wanting to start anew with minimized conflict. I wonder if, as this island nation engages more and more with global systems and online narratives, if this outlook on tolerance will remain. And not to idealize it. I know it's not 100% copacetic between everyone in Timor-Leste, and conflict over ideologies has been happening since the beginning of humanity. But it is kind of a reality check for the world to self-reflect on what we direct our energy towards. I do want to end this episode on a thought process that was constantly running through my head during my time in Timor-Leste, and it has been since then. This concept of extraction. I spoke with folks about this topic that, as Timor-Leste looks to build up its film industry, how to proactively take steps to prevent it from being extractive. Like any industry, from mining to agriculture to healthcare to anything, really, film and media has potential to be extractive, where it only caters to foreign production companies. Maybe they only hire a few local people on low wages, potentially have negative impact on the environment and the infrastructure while they're there. Maybe they create a film or piece of media with a story or narrative that doesn't reflect well on this country or its people. I've seen it in my home state of Montana. Yes, when out-of-state productions film here, they bring a significant economic boost through spending at local hotels, shops, and eateries. And they do hire some local people, sometimes more than others. But it's not always free of its extractive components. In the workshops, we spoke about how to ensure the film industry in Timor-Leste is designed for and by the people of this place. Sure, foreign productions will be a key component of that industry building, and it can be a really good thing. But if it is a foreign production, how to ensure that there are mandates to hire locals at all stages of production, to pay fair wages to those locals, and that the impact on environment and infrastructure is taken into account and minimized. More importantly, we spoke about the importance of uplifting Timorese filmmaking, Timorese directors, producers, and expand training for all positions involved in production, so that the stories of this place are told by the people here, and the industry is structured in a way that truly benefits them. I see that happening in Montana, and it helps that we have local groups and our state film commission doing what they can to prioritize that approach. In Timor-Leste, also similarly to Montana, this extractive approach can also apply to the tourism economy. Currently, it seems like much of Timor-Leste's tourist economy is still in the development phase, but I did see large posters publicly displayed of high-end resorts proposed to be developed along the coast, all owned by usually Australian companies. I'm sure it's a tricky thing, to say the least. Foreign investment may be necessary to get things going, but is there a way to do that where it's not extractive of the local location? When I went on the scuba dive with Diana Braunschweig, the public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy, we spoke about this topic. She introduced me to a young man, Ivan, the co-founder of the dive shop that we were diving with, Dreamers Dive Academy. As we mentioned, the marine life in this region is remarkable, and scuba diving is a popular pull for tourists to come here. The dive tourism economy in Timor-Leste is not as built up as it is in neighboring nations, but it has the potential to be. Currently, all of the dive shops here are owned by and largely staffed by all non-Timorese people. Dreamers Dive Academy opened their business with a mission to train local Timorese people to be dive masters, instructors, guides, and to be the ones working all of the support team positions, as well as encourage them to be the scientists that are studying this critical marine ecosystem, rather than it only being scientists who come from abroad. At the time I was there, Yvonne had been leading conversations and was active in committees to inform the nation's leadership and those involved in building up the tourism economy to look at the benefits of designing things in a way to incentivize things that are locally owned and locally guided, and with the focus on having an environmental benefit, or at least no negative impact, genuine ecotourism, and truly sustainable tourism, where it sustains the betterment of the three pillars equally: the local people, the environment, and the local economy. I definitely don't have answers. In this, I'm just an observer, and I know things are complex. It's a conundrum, though. If you need foreign support for development, is it possible for that support to not come at the cost of extraction? A question that applies all over the world. I'd like to believe that it can, though it will be an incremental, heavy lift to shift things. Though I do believe it's possible to shift to this reality where travel and tourism can truly benefit a local economy, benefit local environments, benefit the people who call it home and are connected to that place in a way that others will never know, but maybe can learn from. We see this in Montana. The tourism industry drives the state's economy. We economically depend on it. And it's important for people to experience this place and hopefully gain lessons from that experience. And it's for no one to gatekeep. But in the last decade, the extractive ways of tourism have become more apparent. Largely people with money who descend upon the place, not caring to connect with local people, but more so play cowboy or get their epic hiking photo for Instagram. And that's not everyone, of course. But it's also just the sheer volume of people on the trails, the rivers, the roads, and it all has a serious ecological impact. Another ripple effect is sometimes when folks visit here on vacation or see it depicted on film or television, they get the idea to move here. And a lot of times they're wealthier than the people who are local here. Maybe they just want a second or third vacation home. These trends, combined with the place getting a makeover to cater to a romanticized version of things that tourists may demand, is a type of gentrification, and it makes the cost of living there locally go through the roof. Suddenly, locals can't afford to live there because housing prices have gone up. They can't afford to eat there in the restaurants. You look around and every element is catering to those who come to extract the benefits and beauty of the place, romanticize it, and disregard the reality of it. Disregard the actual pressures that the landscape faces or that the local people face. And to see that happen in my own home of Montana, and then acknowledge that places like Hawaii or countless places around the world have experienced this exact reality and trend for decades, or had it happen through colonization for centuries. Many people I've heard complain about the extractive tourism in Montana themselves may do the same thing on trips to other places without connecting the dots. And I get it. I don't mean to ruin people's vacations. I'm guilty of it too. But maybe a little awareness of this can go a long way, that we can shift what it means to travel, what it means to be a tourist, to learn from and respect a place that we are visiting. I have seen it in certain places where the tourism is indeed designed to be non-extractive, where the model is that all of the shops, the restaurants, the hotels, everything is truly locally owned, and how the tourism is built up is a group decision made by locals who live there. Now, of course, this can get messy, as not all locals are going to have the same idea of what they want, but it is interesting to see that it is possible to design an area's tourism to be non-extractive. I'm a strong proponent of travel, of cultural exchange, of learning about others' reality. I've always had a deep hunger to learn about cultures, landscapes, ways of life different than my own. As a teenager, I would lose myself in books or films that featured distant places, distant cultures. I longed to travel, to be out of my comfort zone. I think this was greatly influenced by my upbringing, adults in my family who encouraged this curiosity. My grandmother was a Swiss woman born and raised in Argentina. Spanish was her first language, French her second, and English followed. She had a constant curiosity and appreciation of multicultural awareness. Even still in her 70s, she saved her modest money to do solo trips to countries she'd never been to. In my 20s, when I was fortunate to have my camera work take me to over 35 countries, whenever I returned to the States, I would call her or sit at her kitchen counter if I was visiting home in Montana. She would ask me 1,000 questions, not about my experience necessarily, but more about the culture and the place. What was the food like? What languages were spoken? What were the sounds and smells in the market? What lifestyle and cultural formalities did I witness? What pressures are the people or the environments there facing? What did you learn about the place you experienced? I think this way of being a traveler in another place is important. It can be an antidote to the dark corners of stereotyping and ignorance where hate can be born out of. I support the lessons learned from stepping out of your comfort zone, the humility of learning that there are so many ways for a society to conduct itself, so many ways to be alive in this world, that yours is not better than any other, that celebration of difference, as well as recognition of commonalities, are both beautiful discoveries. I recognize it's a privilege to be able to travel. My travel has largely been for work, or on a shoestring budget, if on my own dime. But I still recognize both of those things are privileged opportunities for me to have. And I've not always been the model tourist. I don't mean to tell you how to vacation, but like I said, maybe it is just an awareness. A shift in how we see tourism, a shift in how it is designed in the first place, and not in a way that solely prioritizes the traveler and meeting them where they're at, catering to create a romanticized version of that place, but showing the traveler the benefit of truly being a guest in a place, to learn, to support positively, and to not partake in things that literally displace the people, the ecosystems, the cultures that exist there. I hope we can all ask questions of how we can consciously design and be patrons of all industries in a way that's not extractive. From tourism, to film, to healthcare, to energy development, to literally every single industry. And just my 2 cents, but I do hope that Timor-Leste as a nation can stay true to developing in a way that truly honors, respects, and benefits the environment and people who call it home. I have gratitude to the people and place of the nation of Timor-Leste and for my brief experience there. Again, this is largely my perspective, and I encourage you to seek out stories and perspectives of the Timorese people from the Timorese people. Thank you so much to Salvador de Jesus for your incredible hosting, friendship, and partnership, to Ratna Cusmeo for her friendship and support in the workshops, and for teaching me how to peel cassava root and surprising me with a fantastic birthday cake. Thank you to the young, inspirational Timorese people who spent time with us in the workshops, taught me so much, and who shared for this episode. Thank you to Roger at the Centro Audiovisual Max Stahl. Thank you to Salvador's family for their hospitality, to Diana Braunschweig with the U.S. Department of State, and to McKenna Andrews and the Mansfield Center and the Department of State for making the Waisili Professional Exchange Program possible. Find links to everything mentioned here in this episode's show notes. We appreciate it if you're able to share this episode with others and subscribe to the Stories for Action podcast to hear more stories that create connections and encourage you to find your role for positive impact. Shout out to our Life in the Land project, which is a series of films and podcasts hearing from folks in rural Montana, speaking to the value in community-guided and collaborative efforts. This content is free and available at lifeintheland.org, and reach out if you'd like to screen a film to kick off deeper dialogue on these topics in your community, organization, or classroom. Find out more about all of Stories for Action's work, including film production and story workshops, at storiesforaction.org. And check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Stories for Action. Thank you all so much for being part of our community, where our mission is to use the power of storytelling to create human connection and advance a thriving planet for all.